Yeah, you can be seated. A good afternoon to all of you, Your Excellencies, colleague professors, colleagues, students, PhD researchers, family and friends, for this special event, the inaugural lecture of our dear colleague, June Borras. And after having had his master degree here and his PhD degree, he now gets his official professor's title. Of course, he already is professor for a longer time, but this is the official inaugural. Very much warm welcome to ISS of Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Normally we have with an inaugural lecture, a laudatio, kind of an introduction. But this time we do it a bit differently. We first start with the inaugural by June, and then we have the introduction by... So there must be a reason for that. I'm not sure. Wish you a nice time. June, can I invite you? Please take the floor. And we are very much looking forward to hear your lecture.
Well, thank you, Madam Rector. There are important changes in land politics and agrarian movements that have implications in academic research and political actions. First,
try the other one.
it happens. Oh, wait. I forgot there's an emergency something there. Okay, take two. There are important changes in land politics and agrarian movements that have implications in academic research and political actions. First, land politics today are more diverse than its conventional notion during the past century. Second, social movements that mobilize around land have been transformed in the context of their response to changing context, especially those related to environmental and food politics. Third, all these changes have inspired a new generation of highly energized agrarian scholar activists. All these have contributed to a revival of critical agrarian studies, that is, the study of dynamics of social change in and in relation to the countryside. I will discuss three topics today, namely land politics, agrarian movements, and scholar activism. That's the outline. Oh, that explains. Okay, that's the outline. It's always like something. Okay. The contemporary global land rush. Mainstream narratives about the food, energy, finance, and climate change crises tell us that there is a solution to these problems. The solution lies in the existence of marginal, underutilized, empty, and available lands. It is assumed that these lands can be put to productive use without displacing villagers because these lands are assumed to be empty and available. This has resulted in the current global land grabbing phenomenon today. Mainstream thinkers believe that land deals can be managed through good governance principles and instruments, like transparency instruments, business and human rights frameworks, and corporate social responsibility. But this assumption is contested. The narrative that supports large-scale land investments is anchored on an old assumption that the institutions of access to and control over land and the way production is organized in agrarian societies are economically inefficient. The efficiency argument suggests that while the peasant economy may be able to help villagers to self-provision, it will not be able to feed the growing world population. Another assumption is that some forms of agrarian society's production systems are ecologically destructive. There have been cycles of campaigns to illegalize practices of shifting cultivation, livestock raising, artisanal fishing, and other types of livelihoods by forest-dwelling communities. Today, this narrative has found a new justification in the climate change mitigation and adaptation discourse. What we are witnessing today is a double whammy, the fusion of the two narratives. Table 1. In critical agrarian studies, conventional land reform, namely rural agricultural in the South, category 1, in that box, is found in one of the 4 categories of land politics today. But that category, rural agricultural South, remains probably one of the most politically significant categories, if not the most important, for the fact that it implicates perhaps the greatest number of poor people. The other categories, which have always existed but were never hot topics in agrarian studies, have become increasingly politically important. The category rural non-agricultural South, that is category 2, has become or should become an equally compelling category in agrarian studies. Category 2 is implicated in a wide variety of climate change mitigation and adaptation policies, neoliberal conservation, surge in hydropower projects, and the expansion of no-dwelling zones in fragile areas in response to climate change. Recent demographic changes and patterns of capital accumulation have altered some patterns in urban-rural links. The rural and urban categorization has increasingly become even more blurred. Categories 3 and 4, in the same table, have become important land issues in their own right, where capital attempts to seize as much resources, space, and people as it can capture in order to further accumulation. During the past 2 decades, we saw an explosion of land conflicts worldwide that are located in urban and peri-urban places, involving both agricultural and non-agricultural issues. Class antagonism rooted in land is more diverse today. Land-owning classes remain entrenched, but the current context has brought in social forces that are equally, if not more, vicious. They include new corporate land grabbers, both transnational and domestic, non-corporate but pervasive land buyers, entrepreneurs, speculators, brokers, renters, scammers, swindlers, as well as financial entities that include pension funds, supermarket chains, and food empires, as Jan Dawie van der Ploeg calls them, and layers of non-traditional agricultural investors ranging from automobile companies to livestock processors and big conservation groups. In setting where the land is needed, but the people are not, as Tanya Lee puts it, it's likely that villagers would be expelled from their land. But capital is not committed to a particular mechanism or form of land control as long as its venture generates profit. Hence, we are also seeing land deals that incorporate poor villagers as workers or through contract farming. There are 3 political conditions of land access that require differentiated approaches to democratization of resource access and control. The first is where there is a mass of landless and near landless people that needed land. In this context, the task is to promote redistributive land policies, like conventional land reforms, shared tenancy, and leasehold reforms. The second is where people have existing access to land, but it is threatened by various socioeconomic and political processes. The task in such settings is to protect existing access through a range of institutional interventions, like indigenous peoples' territorial rights, community land certification, leasehold reforms. The third is where people have been expelled from their lands through various forms of coercion. In such a situation, the task is to restore the access to land. This can be done through various types of land restitution. All these three scenarios do happen in rural and urban, agricultural and non-agricultural lands in both the Global South and North. Promote, protect, and restore democratic land access then are the main challenges and political tasks in land politics today. Collectively, this includes conventional land reform, but goes way beyond that. Whether and how land politics can be democratized depends on the balance of power among state and social forces. How organized agrarian and land movements are able to strengthen and expand its ranks and link up and speak to the more widespread, amorphous, and spontaneous rural villagers' land struggles will be a factor to shifting the balance of power in favor of working class claim making from below. We now turn our discussion to this topic. Agrarian movements. The changing context has implications on how agrarian movements emerged and how their political character has evolved. This can be seen in three ways. First, transnationalization of agrarian movements. Second, diversification of land struggles. And third, broadening of cross-class and multi-sectoral movements and alliances around social justice struggles. Transnationalization. In the late 1980s, some agrarian movements started to establish common political threads that would string together movements and collective actions vertically, giving rise to contemporary transnational agrarian movements. This was in reaction to the adverse impact of neoliberal globalization on the rural world. The most politically coherent and significant group among the contemporary transnational agrarian movements is La Via Campesina, founded in 1993. La Via Campesina reframed contemporary agrarian struggles in at least two strategic ways. First, when it launched food sovereignty during the World Food Summit in Rome in 1996, kickstarting food sovereignty as a political project and polycentric movement. Second is its anti-WTO struggle that started in the 1980s during the GATT negotiations and peaked at the WTO meeting in Cancun, Mexico in 2003. But whatever victory La Via Campesina achieved in the struggle against GATT, WTO, would paradoxically also mean a relative loss of a key rallying issue and battle cry afterwards. Other issues like GMO and land grabbing would not have the same universal effect of solidarity, mobilizing energy and militancy among La Via Campesina members and beyond. Whether emerging issues and struggles around climate change could match the anti-WTO historical highlight remains to be seen. But while La Via Campesina is the most famous transnational agrarian movement, it is not the only important group. There are more than a dozen politically important radical transnational agrarian movements, and most of these are members of the IPC for Food Sovereignty, seen in the slide over there. Individually and collectively, the listed transnational agrarian movements in Table 2, except for La Via Campesina, are all academically understudied and politically underappreciated. Just looking at the list in Table 2 tells us how little we know about transnational agrarian movements and how lopsided research and political attention has been. There are aspects of the current agrarian movements that remain understudied. I'll briefly discuss just one. Ebbs and flows are permanent aspects of agrarian movements. That organizations rise and fall is nothing extraordinary or surprising. What is problematic is when transnational agrarian movements are unable to institute mechanisms that enable them to adjust to constant political dynamics. For example, a dead organization continues to occupy a privileged seat at the table, while a newly born, vibrant organization is denied entry, or the old guards refuse to share power with the younger generation of leaders. These issues are seldom critically examined, partly because they are awkward and sensitive matters. Yet movements risk and face embarrassment when they are forced on occasion to expel or suspend some members, as the history of La Via Campesina has shown us, or self-liquidate, as demonstrated in the case of the International Federation of Agricultural Producers, IFAP, a powerful rich farmers international federation that imploded in 2010. Agrarian movements interested in land issues are no longer confined to farmers' movements calling for conventional land reform in order to establish small-scale family farms or middle peasantry. What we are witnessing is the emergence of social movements that reflect the changing character of land politics. This can be seen in at least 4 ways. First, agrarian movements rooted in and oriented towards farming remain a key pillar in agrarian movements today. But it has to be noted that the current agrarian movements heavily oriented towards conventional land reform struggles in the South are generally thin, despite celebratory claims about some of the most famous country cases. Meanwhile, significant reconcentration of land in the North has triggered renewed interest and mobilizations of farmers around land in this part of the world, like Europe. All these involve land struggles, but not in the context of South-oriented conventional land reform. Second, the rise of agrarian movements rooted in the countryside, but whose principal interests and demands are not agricultural in character, is a significant development in the global agrarian movement front during the past 3 decades. Examples include movements against big conservation and mining. These movements are agrarian because the contestation remains centrally about land control, and they are primarily located in the countryside. This type of agrarian movements is likely to become more important in the era of climate change and land grabs. As capital widens its geographic area of target to secure cheap, if not free, natural resources and labor, and open up new markets, more spaces are penetrated by and people are integrated into capital accumulation processes. Third, emerging urban agriculture-oriented initiatives and movements are another important trend to note. As cities get packed, many urban poor creatively or desperately struggle to self-provision in any way imaginable, including food production in and around the city, planting food crops in any small patch of land that they can find, on roadsides, along railroad tracks, in vacant lots, often informally and or illegally. Recently, this phenomenon has begun to run parallel to and at times to overlap with a more consciously organized and orchestrated urban agriculture movement. This emerging trend is of small and scattered efforts, often amorphous in form, but the logic giving birth to them deserves attention. Fourth and finally, emerging land-oriented urban mobilizations and movements that are not agriculture-oriented are worth noting. Capital encroaches into urban non-agricultural spaces and people-provoking mobilizations by local communities. These are people with obvious land questions in urban spaces, but different from the conventional notion of land question in agrarian studies. Contemporary agrarian movements increasingly find themselves transformed or forming alliances with 2 other movements, namely environmental and food movements. First, as capitalist encroachment heightens in rural spaces, agrarian and environmental movements are linked more closely. The transformation of some agrarian movements into environmental justice movements, or the emerging coalitions between agrarian and environmental justice movements, may be heading towards a new frontier, because many of the environmental justice movements are now forming the basis for climate justice movements. Agrarian movements are increasingly framing their current narratives as agrarian issues in the era of climate change. How such a convergence will unfold is likely to transform the way we carry out research on and political activism around agrarian politics. Second, the transformation of many agrarian movements into broad food sovereignty movements, and or the coming together of these two sets of movements, concretely and discursively, is probably one of the most politically significant and academically exciting developments at the agrarian or food politics research fronts. This transformation and or convergence has brought so much fresh energy into the political activist and scholarly work. The synergies between these movements and by extension research interests about these have been rejuvenating in various ways. One of the difficult questions for these movements to address is whether environmental and climate justice and food sovereignty are possible to achieve within capitalism. The flip side of this question is our conversation around reimagining a socialist alternative. In short, land politics and agrarian movements have been transformed, and such transformation has generated academic and political interest, especially among younger generation of engaged researchers. We now direct our discussion to agrarian scholar activism. By scholar activists, I mean those who explicitly aim not only to interpret the world in scholarly ways, but who also aim to change it, and who are connected unapologetically to political projects and movements. The category of scholar activists is a subset of academics when they work in academic institutions, or of activists when they work in activist organizations or agrarian movements. This means they are just a small subset of a bigger category, and they are not the only relevant actors generating radical and progressive ideas. Progressive and radical academics and activists are even bigger knowledge producers. But my paper and my talk refers only to a smaller section of this wider community. There are three types of scholar activists, all of which are connected to political projects and movements. Namely, first, scholar activists who are primarily located in academic institutions who do activist work. Second, scholar activists who are principally based in social movements or political projects and do scholar activism from within. And third, scholar activists who are mainly located in non-academic independent research institutions. Francis Fox Piven explains that tensions arise, quote, when we commit ourselves to the more troubling sorts of demands that advance the interests and ideas of groups that are at the margins of public life, the people who are voiceless, degraded, and exploited. When we commit ourselves to the often disorderly movements that try to advance the political causes of these groups, when we join our critiques of the institutional arrangements that the movements are trying to change, to commitment to the movement itself. It is this sort of divided commitment between an academic career and dissident activism that provokes reflection on how to do both. End of quote. For Charles Hale, dual commitments is the defining character of scholar activists to the academia and the political struggle. Hale's argument is, and I quote, neither that activist research methods are appropriate to all academic projects, nor that all innovative, radical, or transformative knowledge is produced in this way. Rather, activist research methods stand as one option among many, but they are especially appropriate to employ when an organized group in a struggle is intensely concerned with the analytical question at hand and when the very conditions of their struggle involve a challenge to the existing analytical paradigms. End of quote. The overall treatment in the literature of the concept of a scholar activist, however, remains too academy-centered, that is, examining scholar activists based in academic institutions. This represents only one of the three types. The other two are as profoundly important, but they are largely undervalued and understudied. What we know about them is limited, but enough to convince us that they play a critical role in knowledge production and political action. The interplay between these three categories is another matter that is probably least known and understood. I suspect that such interaction actually plays a critical role in academic research and political work. Yeah. It is important that agrarian activism be approached partly in reference to agrarian movements and questions of external alliances, the organization of production, impoverishment and drudgery, insertion into particular social structures and agrarian institutions, all conspire to put huge constraints on the ability of rural villagers to engage in contentious politics. There is the need for external allies who could help address constraints and obstacles. During the past century, the most consistent allies of the peasantry and agrarian movements were revolutionary communist and socialist parties. That era ended. Today, critical agrarian studies and agrarian scholar activism are carried out in partly different terms and topics. Most agrarian scholar activists emerged from post-political party social movement initiatives of the 1980s and onward, and have been recruited into or have joined social movements from different entry points. An important source of the surge of agrarian scholar activism today comes from the food movements that have seen great dynamism from the 1990s onwards. Recently, there seems to be another wave of expansion of agrarian scholar activism from the environmental and climate justice front. The academic fields that are getting drawn into critical agrarian studies have also expanded beyond the conventional parameters of agrarian studies, while reaffirming the centrality of agrarian political economy. A good activist is irreverent, subversive, and passionate, at least in Alinsky's definition. A good academic is prim, respectful, and clinical, at least in a stereotype profile. These contradictory qualities are what define scholar activists. This leads to a permanent tension and contradiction faced by scholar activists. The challenges for scholar activists in dealing with the requirements of academic work can be seen in at least two ways. First, and on the one hand, is academic rigor. This means being thorough, meticulous, precise, careful, and convincing, theoretically, methodologically, and empirically. There are academic arbiters, including peer review panels, editorial committees, and research councils, to judge the rigor of a research grant application or manuscript. Academic rigor is easy for a dedicated academic to deal with. It becomes complicated when the dual commitments of scholar activists come into the picture. Again, Charles Hale argues that, and I quote, how political commitments at times prioritize analytical closure over further complexity make activist research difficult to defend in an academic setting. End of quote. Political rigor, on the other hand, is the benchmark for agrarian movements. It means being politically informed and thorough, nuanced and sharp, and relevant and timely. It should be the opposite of a post-mortem way of thinking and doing things. Some political movements have long-standing traditions that function in some ways similar to the academic peer review. In Maoist-inspired movements, for example, the principles of unity, struggle, unity, and criticism, self-criticism, are aimed at achieving theoretical and political rigor. There are movement arbiters of political rigor as well. Movement leaders, cadres, militants, and bewildering layers of movement brokers, gatekeepers, and cheerleaders. Academic and political rigor may not sit well with each other and can even be contradictory, although they can also be complementary and synergistic. The most difficult challenge for scholar activists is how to address academic and political rigor simultaneously. Second, impact. There are different traditions among and between agrarian movements and the academy in terms of understanding and measuring research impact, and this can be contradictory, although not always necessarily so. For social movements, it can be straightforward, making some real-life change, such as actually stopping a dam construction or redistributing land to peasants, or producing reports that reframe not only international policy and academic debates, but the very political opportunity structure for agrarian movements to mobilize, such as the land grabs report by Grain in 2008, or the series of reports by the Drugs and Democracy Program of the Transnational Institute, TNI. It is quite different on the side of academics. Impact measurement in academic terms include publication points that are dependent on publication outlets ranked according to their impact factor, whatever that means. Citation impact is also valued. There is a citation impact tracker called H-index, which is a measure of the extent to which your publication has been cited by other publications. Often, these two seem to be operating in different dimensions, but they really don't have to because they can be complementary. This is especially so because academics can be outperformed by non-academy-based scholar activists on some academic metrics. I'm sure we can quickly recall many of the classics in the field produced by scholar activists based in institutions like Food First, or that many non-academy-based public intellectuals have citation metrics higher than the average academics. Conversely, there are academy-based researchers whose work have major impact in reshaping public actions. That agrarian movements need scholar activists as allies is not an issue. The issue is the terms of that relationship. One-way instrumentalist relationships mark many of the interactions between scholar activists and agrarian movements. There are two dominant variants. First is the tendency based on the implicit assumption that agrarian movements are ill-informed and have low levels of knowledge and capacity to produce, to understand and change their situation. The task for scholar activists is to do research for these movements, to inform their political work and build the movement's capacity. Knowledge generation remains primarily the domain of scholar activists. This approach gives scholar activists a vanguard role in terms of knowledge generation, and many agrarian movements, for various reasons, tend to be compliant. The extreme version of this tendency is a dual problem of vanguardism by scholar activists and tailism by agrarian movements. Second is the tendency where agrarian movements set the agenda and scholar activists just follow. This is based on a romanticized idea that everything that agrarian movements say and do is good and correct. In a way, it is a distorted version of a generic Maoist notion of massline. Taking at face value what the movement leaders say or show sometimes leads scholar activists to support processes that do not deserve support, or in the failure to support deserving ones. The worst combination is when there is a triangular interaction between, first, undemocratic and despotic caudillo agrarian movement leaders. Second, layers of movement brokers, gatekeepers, and cheerleaders, some of whom are naive and or impetuous petty bourgeois intellectuals, while others are entrepreneurial opportunists. And third, uncritical scholar activists who take the grand claims by these layers of movement elites at face value. In this context, sometimes scholar activists become either a victim of or a party to a political pyramid or Ponzi scheme. The extreme version of this tendency is a dual problem of vanguardism of agrarian movements and tailism of scholar activists. Both tendencies are instrumentalist and problematic. But there is a third approach that exists, and most of the scholar activists gathered here today belong to. That is, a two-way mutually reinforcing interactive approach. On the one hand, this approach values the importance of scholar activists to help agrarian movements overcome constraints and obstacles to extending the reach of their political struggles. On the other hand, this approach values the autonomy of agrarian movements in the conduct of their movement building and collective actions. An important starting point for such an approach is an honest, transparent, and clinical understanding of where each is coming from and what their agendas are. It is an approach that recognizes and respects the autonomy of both parties, not just the autonomy of agrarian movements. A two-way mutually reinforcing approach to scholar activist and agrarian movement relationship necessarily leads to both parties internalizing their contradictions. The existence of synergy and tension defines such a healthy but inherently conflict-ridden relationship. Wrapping up, the recent changes in land politics, agrarian movements, and scholar activism reaffirm the relevance of critical agrarian studies as a field that champions both academic and political rigor. A strategy to pursue scholar activism around agrarian movements and land politics is one that is movement-oriented. On the one hand, it is movement-oriented because it should not shy away from linking up with and contributing to emancipatory agrarian movements and political projects, however imperfect and flawed these are. On the other hand, it is movement-oriented because it aims to carry out research both individually and collectively within and through a research movement. A research movement that has the characteristics of a social movement, that is, based upon shared assumptions and visions about the world as we know it and the world that we wanted to build. It values formal research networks but goes beyond them. It is amorphous, fluid, informal, inspired, and inspiring, and is able to connect to younger generations of creative and radical thinkers. It should be orchestrated and spontaneous, able to navigate the difficult terrain between vanguardism and tailism among scholar activists and agrarian movements. It should be diffuse, but with clear hubs of imagination and creativity in an operationally polycentric manner. It should be dispersed across the three key sites of academy, non-academic independent research institutions, and social movements. Only then can we go beyond individual agenda setting and individual accomplishments and transform agrarian scholar activist research into a real force for social justice. In closing, the dual commitments by scholar activists to the academia and the political struggles can sometimes lead to scholar activists feeling the task of confronting a double burden. But Frances Fox Piven puts it in a way that captures what I think most scholar activists in general think and feel. She says, and I quote, "Scholar activists should stop regarding themselves as martyrs. We are activists because of the joy political work gives us. Because even when we fail, working to make our society fairer, kinder, more just, gives a satisfaction like no other. Because the comrades we find in the effort are friends like no other. And also because our activist efforts illuminate our social and political world in ways that scholarship alone never can. Emancipatory greetings to you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Borras, for a very inspiring lecture. It's now my honor to introduce Professor Mark Edelman, who will introduce us further to June. Professor Edelman, he's an anthropologist, and he's professor at New York, University of New York, the city of New York. He attended the University of Chicago and received his BA and PhD degrees in anthropology from Columbia. And he worked for more than 3 decades on rural development, agrarian history, peasant and farmer movements, mostly, but not only, in Latin America. He has been writing a couple of books, co-authored, just to indicate and mention a couple of them: Social Democracy in a Global Periphery, Political Dynamics of Transnational Agrarian Movements, The Anthropology of Development and Globalization. And he's part of 9 editorial boards, and just to mention again a couple of them: American Ethnologist, the Journal of Global and Historical Anthropology, and last but not least, the Journal of Peasant Studies, which is of course headquartered here. I can't think about anyone else who can so nicely introduce Professor Borras to us. Professor Edelman, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It is a distinct honor and a true delight to be here and to deliver the Laudatio at the inaugural lecture of Professor Dr. Saturnino M. Borras, Jr. At the outset, I would like to convey my profound thanks to the International Institute of Social Studies and to Rector Inga Hutter for the invitation to come to The Hague. I can assure those of you present today that there is nobody else in the world, apart from June Borras, for whom I would cross the Atlantic to make a 2-day cameo appearance in Europe. The reason June Borras occupies such an important place in my own invisible college and in those of so many friends and colleagues here today is that he embodies a uniquely dynamic, thoughtful, innovative, and exciting combination of groundbreaking scholarship, mentorship, committed activism, and field and institution building. There are so many strands to the complex web of Jun's professional and political life that it's difficult to know where to begin or how to represent such a reticulated reality in linear form for a written text and oral presentation. It's also challenging for me because the laudatio or laudation is a genre that barely exists in my country. I understand that it's supposed to be rather like the academic introduction, but this is one of the most formulaic and predictable of the genres we academics work in. And Jun, in the paper that forms the basis of today's lecture, invokes Saul Alinsky and calls on us to be irreverent. So what follows, and June Borras is a hard act to follow, may or may not be a proper laudatio. I won't elaborate in detail Jun's astonishingly prolific output of books, articles, edited journal issues, working papers, and concept notes, most of them elegantly written in what he once told me is his 3rd language. Nor will I dwell on Jun's impressive efforts to advance a progressive agenda within international policy and governance institutions, such as UNDP or the FAO's high-level panel of experts on the land grabbing that occurred during and after the 2008 food crisis. I will mention now, but will not explore, Jun's institutional commitments, which, in addition to ISS, span the globe, from China Agricultural University in Beijing to the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam to Food First in California. Instead, I will try to address key achievements and themes and to compose a praise song for Jun, one of my most valued interlocutors, collaborators, co-authors, friends, and as he might say, comrades. The intertwining of intellectual accomplishment and political action characterized Jun's life from early on. When he graduated at the top of his high school class in the Philippines, he was already deeply involved in the peasant movement and in the struggle against the Marcos dictatorship. His early education and intellectual maturation are intimately bound up with these experiences. Some of his most important mentors, in addition to those he had here at ISS many years later, were organic intellectuals in the Philippine movements, people whose audacity, intellectual acuity, and knowledge of politics and agrarian issues resulted from deep commitments, struggle, adversity, and movement study, and not necessarily from years of university training. Jun Boris was part of a small group of utopian visionaries, activists from peasant movements in Europe, Latin America, North America, and South and Southeast Asia that in the early 1990s founded the international peasants and farmers movements, La Via Campesina. For several years, he was a member of Via Campesina's International Coordinating Commission. This work thrust Jun into the thick of transnational organizing and into a widening network of extraordinary militants and thinkers of diverse points of view and from different world regions. It also gave him a profound understanding from the inside of the potentials, advantages, complexities, and perils of linking and coordinating activist projects across borders. Many social movements have short lives, but Via Campesina, despite some fits and starts, has grown remarkably over the past 2 decades. Very importantly, even though Jun eventually left the peasant movement to pursue graduate studies and a career in academia, he never really left the movement. I knew this intellectually, but it became abundantly clear to me when Jun and I coincided at the 6th International Conference of Via Campesina in Jakarta in 2013. The 20th anniversary of the movement's founding. Some 3,000 delegates attended from every continent except Antarctica, and several times I heard one or another of them, the older movement veterans, approach Jun and express wonder and amazement at how the tiny seed they had planted so many years before had grown into this massive worldwide process of struggle. When I say that Jun never really left the movement, I also mean something else that is very important to explaining his impact in academia and in what academics sometimes like to call the real world. Jun is very much his own person in thinking through his many research and policy projects, but it's also the case that he often follows the lead of and pursues the questions that are most pressing for the movements and that the movements pose to him. He sees himself, I believe, as being at the service of the movements, but he is far from being their uncritical servant. On the contrary, the trust and authority that he enjoys in movement circles allows him to engage in frank discussions with activists that other scholars might prefer to avoid or not be able to initiate in the first place. These interchanges in turn put the activists and movements on a more solid footing as they are operating with a deeper, more solid knowledge base. Jun has a magnificent capacity for synthesis. He can almost always see the forest without getting hung up in the trees. I'm kind of the opposite. I see the trees. And this benefits activists, practitioners, scholars, students, and all the rest of us. Jun Boris is, of course, well known at ISS, where he obtained his doctorate, worked as a lecturer, and after a stint of several years in Canada, returned as an associate professor, and most recently, as Professor of Agrarian Studies, the appointment that we are honoring and celebrating today. While he was Canada Research Chair at St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, Jun set up a network that he called Initiatives in Critical Agrarian Studies, or ICAS. From the beginning, Critical Agrarian Studies, as Jun conceived it, sought to pose an intellectual, political, and policy alternative to the hegemonic paradigms about the rural world, particularly those copiously funded free market-based analyses and prescriptions emanating from mainstream development institutions such as the World Bank. Like critical legal studies or critical race theory, critical agrarian studies has emerged as a dynamic field with many branches and many geographical and institutional locations that together form a broad progressive challenge to the conventional wisdom. I should add, in fairness, that Jun is not averse to dialoguing with proponents of the conventional wisdom. Indeed, it was in this building at a conference 10 years ago that I first met Jun and also Klaus Denninger of the World Bank, who tried to make a case to a largely unsympathetic audience for unleashing market forces to facilitate agrarian reform. Field building occurs in a context, in this case a growing convergence of environmental, economic, and social crises that contributed to alliances and more wide-ranging thinking among agrarian, food justice and food sovereignty, environmentalist and women's movements, as well as those of indigenous peoples and of other oppressed groups. Critical agrarian studies existed before Jun Boras, but its strength today and its future promise, represented in new generations of scholar activists, owe a huge amount to his efforts. What are the mechanisms of this field, critical agrarian studies, which Jun Boras has infused with so much dynamism? There's the ICUS Little Books on Big Ideas series, which is now published 6 volumes, and which appears in 8 languages other than English. There's the Journal of Peasant Studies, which under Jun's editorship vaulted to the absolute pinnacle of the impact factor ratings for virtually all social science journals. More important to me, and I suspect to other people here today, than the impact factor is that Jun's leadership of the JPS Collective showed that an academic journal could actually be interesting to read and politically relevant and exciting to work on. In the increasingly rarefied atmosphere of elite universities and with increasingly specialized forms of knowledge production, interesting academic journal usually seems like an oxymoron. But with JPS, Jun's extraordinary vision and capacity for hard work proved that there could be meaningful exceptions. JPS, together with Jun and his collaborators, has contributed very significantly to reshaping understandings of land grabbing and land governance, environmental politics, food sovereignty, flex crops, biofuels, and peasant and farmer movements, among other important topics. There are the networks that Jun was instrumental in conceptualizing and organizing, such as the Land Deal Politics Initiative and the BRICS Initiative in Critical Agrarian Studies. LDPI and BICAS have played important roles in Jun's field-building efforts. LDPI, for example, helped to reset the research agenda on land grabbing, raising new questions, proposing new methods, and probably most important, linking activists, practitioners, and scholars from different generations, language groups, geographical locations, and institutions. The conferences that Jun has organized, including those done as part of these networks, accomplish multiple objectives. They provide for the quick online presentation of high-quality, cutting-edge working papers on pressing issues of immediate policy relevance. They encourage young scholars to showcase their findings and help to launch their careers in or outside of academia. They set research agendas that provide alternatives to the dominant paradigms and conventional wisdom. They provide fodder for the publication of multiple special journal issues and other papers that give us scientific, imprimatur to empirically grounded analyses that, again, constitute alternatives to mainstream dominant assumptions. Very importantly, for many of us in this room, these events break down barriers of nation, language, generation, and political affiliation and nurture rich dialogues and communities of scholars, activists, scholar activists, practitioners, public intellectuals, friends, and comrades. These communities give many of us the strength to go on. They foster optimism of the will in troubling times when many of us are understandably afflicted with pessimism of the intellect. I think it is fair to say that Jun Boras broke the intellectual monopoly that the proponents of conventional wisdom and the magic of the marketplace hoped that they would enjoy around these issues. Jun didn't do this single-handedly because he's very much a catalyst for collective action, but his leadership has been essential, and I can't think of anybody else in our community who has the mobilizational capacity or who inspires such loyalty that they would have been able to pull this off. I'll refer to just one more mechanism of Jun's field-building efforts that also blends intellectual political work with community building. Jun has a well-deserved reputation as a phenomenal mentor. It is said, though I've yet to experience this myself, that he holds marathon 12-hour study sessions at his home where he cooks for and feeds his graduate students and not only mentors them about abstract notions of theory and practice, but also shows them in his typically understated way how to infuse academia with humanity and how to live in this unforgiving and cruel world as if it were the kind of place that we would all like to live in. I was deeply touched that Jun ended the paper that forms the basis of his inaugural lecture with an exhortation from Fran Piven, my colleague at the City University of New York Graduate Center. I won't repeat the quotation here, but it should suffice to say that Piven reminds us of the joy that political work gives us, of the satisfaction that comes from struggling for a better society, and of the special friendships that are built in intellectual and activist struggles. It has been a true pleasure and a tremendous privilege to have come to The Hague to pronounce this laudatio on the unique, varied, and voluminous accomplishments of Saturnino Jun Borras, one of the most distinguished scholars in our field, who is a social justice activist of extraordinary insight, energy, and persistence, and who also happens to be one of the warmest and most generous and inspiring colleagues I know. So Jun, I congratulate you and salute you on this wonderful occasion. ISS and the broader communities of critical agrarian studies and agrarian movements are blessed and fortunate to have you among us. Thank you.
And can I invite you now to come with us to the first floor, to the atrium, to congratulate Professor Borras and have a drink and have a snack and talk and discuss. And we go ahead on the front. Please follow us.